Okay, well, thanks for all the compliments on my coding and my sysadminning. If you saw my website, you'd feel none of those things, because that's
your secret identity.
It's my secret identity, right? So I'm maintaining it up here with this ruse. So in my night job, other than when I'm sysadminning and running excellent code and being a superhero, I come here to talk to you guys about conversations I'm sick of having about diversity. Is everyone excited for this as a pre-lunch talk? Nice, cool. Okay, well, for those of you, actually, how many of you are already familiar to me? Faceless people in the crowd. Okay, I see a few hands amongst the bright lights. I feel a bit like Beyonce, but nice to see some familiar-looking arms. And for the rest of you who don't already know me, I'm Holly. I'm a leadership coach that works with women in male-dominated industries. And I used to be a mining engineer, which is probably not something that most of you in this room have done. Does anybody know much about mining here?
Bit mining. Bitcoin.
Bit mining. Identical to what I did. So, think like Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, or like big yellow trucks, giant holes in the ground. That was my job for 10 years. And I super loved it. It's really, really cool. A little different from bit mining, but equally interesting. And now I am a giant nerd about feminism. I guess I always was, but maybe a little more these days. And I work one-on-one with women to help them build amazing careers and be fantastic leaders in industries where that's kind of hard to do. And I also work with companies to help them get out of the way of those people who are trying to build amazing careers in industries where that's hard to do. So I do a little bit of diversity and inclusion consulting. And something that I noticed throughout all of 2017 is I had just like a ton of conversations with HR people, with managers, with individual contributors about how diversity was going in their org. And something that I noticed throughout all of these many conversations I had is that, D&I work can be hard to do, right? We're talking about large cultural change, and that doesn't happen overnight, and it's not always easy, and it's often messy. But they weren't struggling with that. They were struggling with like all these little things, like tiny little things that were getting in the way. And I just kept having the same conversations over and over and over again, all 2017, which was fun. But I decided in 2018 I might do it differently. And rather than meet individually for coffee with every single one of you and get way too familiar with Starbucks' menu, I thought maybe instead I'll just stand up on stage and have these conversations wholesale with a giant crowd. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So let's jump into it. I've got 5 things we're going to talk about, and hopefully you will go and talk to people about this so that my efforts will get even wider than just this one crowd. So thing number 1 that I talked a lot about was the pipeline. So is anyone here familiar with this concept, the pipeline? Okay, a few people. For those of you who aren't, it's this idea that we have a leaky pipeline, that there's a lot of people, a lot of water, a wide pipeline, a lot of women or other diverse candidates early on in the career, and then they slowly leak out over time, making a smaller and smaller pipeline and a louder and louder microphone. So this is the idea of the pipeline, right? And if I've learned anything over the last year, it's that tech loves solving diversity through recruiting. Whether it is recruiting more little girls to be interested in coding, or whether it's recruiting more women into their orgs, recruiting always seems to be that first thing that they're reaching for. Does that match anybody in this room? Have you got companies that are working on diversity somehow through recruiting? Yeah, pretty common, right? And anybody who's seen me present before or followed me on Twitter will be familiar with this next graph because it's my favorite. And this graph also breaks my heart, even as it's my favorite. This is the percentage of women that are retained in their careers over time. And we've got 2 lines here, a yellow one showing professional women generally, and a pink line showing women in science, technology, engineering, and math. I don't know if you guys noticed this about the pink line, but it is precipitously dropping very quickly. And overall, 60% of women in STEM fields eventually leave their careers over 20 years, versus 10 to 15% women, professional women generally. So we spend all this time and money working on the pipeline, trying to get all these women into the field, and then they all bail. And I mean, it's a little bit heartbreaking, right? The way that I think about it is sort of like if we had a giant swimming pool, and we're like, great, we're gonna fill this thing full of water, but it's got like a giant crater-sized hole in the bottom of it, and we're like, I know, get more hoses. That's how we solve this, right? And I'm running out of hoses, patience, and water, so I feel like this isn't working that well. This is not an amazing plan, right? The recruiting stuff is important. It's still important to to keep the water coming into the swimming pool, as it were, but we need to do something to patch up the hole, right? So where I'm going with this is if your organization is working on diversity and inclusion through recruiting or through early stage efforts to get people interested in the field, then you really need to be spending equal time working on culture and retention and arguably advancement within your organization as well. So that's thing number one. Let's stop only talking about recruiting. Let's broaden the conversation. Thing number two is the idea of 50% representation. Quick poll of the room. How many of you guys would go, Holly Burton, crusader as she is for feminism and womankind, wants 50% representation? Nobody? Oh my God, you've misread my brand so badly. Okay, half a hand up. Good, so I didn't trick you guys. You're actually right. I don't want 50% right now. I actually think 50% right now is pretty unachievable. We've got roughly, I don't know why I'm echoing. We've got, 17% women in tech, right? If we try to hire for 50% right now, we can't really do it without hiring a bunch of people who aren't really qualified to do the thing they're trying to do. 50% is so different from 17, right? It's not possible for us to get to 50%. And occasionally I'll see, I've seen people sit up on stage and go, my company, we're only hiring women until we get to 50%. And I'm like, no, why? Help, this is not good. Because here's the thing, no one's really asking for this. I've not met a single woman who's like, what would really help me with my career? Let's hire a bunch of women who seem like they're not very good, and then let's have me try to prove my competency amongst all of that going on. That seems like paradise. That's a terrible thing. It doesn't make for an easy career, right? So we're not really looking for 50%. And when people think about 50%, they go, ooh, if 50% is what we're aiming for, we can't do that without sacrificing quality. But actually, it's never what we were aiming for in the first place. So what I want for you guys is stop having this discussion about 50. Stop going, whoa, we can't do diversity efforts because 50 is so dangerous. And instead, let's go, okay, mission one is let's make sure that our applicants, for example, in hiring, our applicants match the availability of diverse talent out in the talent pool. Then people who get to a first round interview and a second round interview, make sure that those ratios aren't changing. Once you get there, then you can start talking about moving those percentages up. But that's really the first concern. It's not 50%. Cool? Nice. And while we're on the same subject, I want to talk about the risk of hiring unqualified randos. Anybody worried about this? Hiring a bunch of unqualified randos? I would be worried about this. And all of us really want to work in organizations where promotion and hiring and our general fate is based on merit, right? And I think that a lot of the tech industry, for good and bad, feels like they're doing a pretty good job of this, that merit is a big part of their hiring considerations. We also know that that's not always the case, but there's this sense that that's what we're trying to do. So the idea is, okay, well, if we're trying to hire based on merit, and then we add this extra constraint, like we want to hire preferentially from underrepresented groups, then we might be reducing the importance of merit, right? We might be sacrificing some of that to get this other criteria. And we might end up hiring people who are underqualified. And to that, I have one question. Who exactly is the underqualified rando in this scenario? So something that we know, generally speaking, is that women and other underrepresented minorities are undervalued. That's how bias works, right? Is that we have a certain set of criteria about how people should act or how we want to assess their competency that makes us feel like they're maybe not quite measuring up when they otherwise might be. So that's sort of a built-in feature of bias. That's how it works, right? And let's do a quick example. Let's imagine we've got two candidates, a woman and a man, and we've assessed them both to be perfectly equally qualified. It's like a miracle. This never happens, but we found the two that are exactly the same, right? Hallelujah. What a perfect example, Holly Burton. So we've got these two people. This is a weird graph where I guess on the y-axis it's like qualification level or competency. Go with me on it. And so we set this bar, most qualified, and they both meet it, right? We're like, cool, so if we want to choose which one to hire, we can, take a coin flip, pick 50-50, doesn't really matter. They're both equally qualified, right? But because of how bias works, we know that this isn't really what's happening. If we've assessed them both to be most qualified, but we've got bias in our assessment system, what it actually looks like is like this, where the underrepresented candidate, in this example a woman, has got this like top secret extra bit of qualification that we're struggling to see, right? So if we were actually able to properly assess that level of qualification, if we were able to de-bias how we assess what qualified looks like, we'd find that the line for most qualified was not in fact here, but it was actually way up here. But since we're not doing that and we go, oh, well, 50-50 chance, we're just going to hire whichever one because they're equally qualified, we end up hiring people in what I like to call the unqualified rando zone. Or maybe more charitably, the underqualified rando zone. Maybe it's unfair to call them unqualified. But so cool story, people. We're sitting here worrying, like just worrying so much that, oh my God, if we add this extra constraint, we'll be making it so that we're hiring people who are less qualified. Great news, we're doing it already. It's already happening. So we can stop having a little panic about it because we've been doing it for years and years. That's literally how bias works, right? So for those of us who are really concerned about merit, we actually desperately need to add these extra layers on to help us evaluate merit correctly, right? There's no risk of hiring unqualified randos. It's already happening. Great news. So what we get to do from here is we get to go and play talent Moneyball. Hooray, right? We get to go and learn how to differently evaluate people that are traditionally misunderstood or under-evaluated by basically our competition. So that's an amazing deal, right? I love that. We've turned something that was previously a liability, hiring unqualified randos, into a top secret advantage, right? Maybe that should be my superhero thing for next year. So let's stop having this discussion about unqualified randos. Please God, if you take nothing else from this whole presentation, let it be this thing, okay? And then the last thing I want to tell you guys about is quotas, AKA targets, AKA budgets. The number one thing that would happen to me last year, especially when I was talking to people in HR, would be that apropos of nothing, like not even that I had asked them, like we would sit down and be like, oh, hi, isn't Starbucks a mediocre coffee joint? How are you? And they'd be like, FYI, Holly, just so you're aware, nice to meet you, but I would never consider having a quota. And I'm like, cool, and your name was? Because we've just literally just sat down. And it was like this like shield. They're like, just so you know, we're very ethical. We would never have a quota. We wouldn't dream. It would be so bad for the business. And I'm like, I hadn't even asked you about it, but okay, we can talk about that now. And people get really nervous about the idea of quotas, right? This idea that we're going to like have a bunch of qualified candidates and be like, nope, you're no good to us, you're not a woman. We'll hire this rando off the street instead, right? It's that kind of unqualified rando syndrome again. And I want to talk to you about a story from my mining days. Everyone ready for an exciting story about rocks? Yes. Yeah, great. So, as a mining engineer, I was a long-range planner, which basically means it was my job to like look at all the gold and rocks in the ground and go, how are we going to get this out so that we make the most money? Okay, that was basically my job. And so, you know, everything in mining takes place over like a really long period of time. We don't like mine a whole mine out over the course of a week and be like, well, we're done, moving on to rape and pillage the next earth. It's really about that one piece of land that we've got under our control, right? And it takes like, 10, 20 years. That's a typical life of mine. And so when you're looking at that kind of timeline, time value of money really matters, right? So what you want to do is get the gold out now, not get it out in 5 years, because it won't be worth as much money, right? It's better for you to have it now than you can like invest it, or you can turn it into jewelry, whatever it is that people are going to do with gold. Use it as a hedge for currency. There's all kinds of uses for it, right? So there's big money in being able to produce more gold quickly, or being able to move more rocks quickly, right? That's always a goal in mining. But one thing we know is that if you move quickly, people tend to make mistakes and they tend to hurt themselves. You probably all have had this experience at home where you're like rushing around in the morning, you've got like a piece of toast in your mouth and your hair is all over the place and you're like trying to get your shoes on and you're like hopping all over the house and then you trip over your backpack. No, just me? Okay. You can see how my morning's going. Clearly on time for a lot. So, when we're rushing around, we make mistakes and we tend to injure ourselves, right? And if you're like with a piece of toast in your mouth and hopping around and falling all over your backpack, NBD, your pride is hurt and you get a cool anecdote to tell at DevOpsDays. But if you're driving a haul truck the size of a house, the consequences are a bit bigger. Then people get seriously injured and or die, right? So safety is really of critical importance in the mining industry. And we have these two competing things. One, we'd like to not kill anybody, our cool coworkers that we like. And two, the whole reason we're here is to make money, and we do that by moving quickly. But if we move quickly, we might kill somebody. So what are we gonna do? So what happens when we look at diversity is they go, hey, we've got these two priorities. One, we wanna have more underrepresented people. Two, we wanna hire for merit. And then they go, well, we can't do both. So we just won't hire, we won't make targets. We'll just only focus on the merit thing. Can you imagine if we did this in mining? We'd end up in one of two scenarios. We'd be like, okay, so we're just going to, move all the dirt and everybody dies, NPD, that's not a goal. We're not gonna try to fix that. We're just gonna try to move things real fast. Or alternatively, we're just gonna legs up, chillax in the break room, not run any of the trucks, and everyone will be real safe because we'll be doing nothing, right? I feel like from my professional experience of that industry, neither one really happens. And the reason why it doesn't happen is because we're a bunch of adults, and in business, we do this all the time. We have competing priorities that we set targets about, and then we meet both of those targets. So in a mine, if you produce a lot and hurt people, you don't get a bonus. Or if you put your feet up and you don't produce very much and nobody gets hurt, you also don't get a bonus, right? We do this all the time. It's the same with marketing budgets. You might want to have, more customers, but not blow your marketing budget. You can still have budgets for both of those things, right? And it's the same in diversity. So we really need to kind of take a step back from going, it's impossible for us to both hold merit as something that's important to us and have targets for what we want to achieve in terms of diversity. And I will argue to you guys that if something really matters to you, you have to be willing to measure it. You have to be willing to set targets about it and put it in the budget. And it doesn't mean, just like with safety in the mining industry, that we're just going to hire the next woman off the street or hire the next underrepresented person off the street so that we can hit our budget. Just like if we hit our production targets, we don't be like, well, cool, we're going to take the rest of the month off, be real safe, right? That's not how it works, and it wouldn't be how it worked in diversity either. So there's nothing special about it. It's not some weird aspect of business that we should treat differently than everything else. And one more thing, since I've got you guys all dreaming of targets now, let's talk about how we're going to measure those things. So once people are done calming me down, informing me that there will be no quotas, in fact, Holly Burton, right? The next thing that usually happens in these conversations is I go, oh, cool, so tell me about your diversity stats at your company. What do you got going on? And they're like, oh, we have 30% of women overall. And I'm like, cool story, bros. That means nothing to me. I don't even know what that means. And you can have a company that's 30% women where you just have very, very high representation in incredibly female-dominated sections of that company, right? Or you can have a company where you don't have a lot of that and you've got a ton of female devs, and that's cool, right? But let me say this definitively, don't give yourself credit for the stuff that's easy. You're not gonna get any diversity awards for me being like, hey, we increased our HR budget, which is sort of 90% women, and then we hired a bunch more women. Aren't we doing well? I'd be like, well, I don't know. What are you going to do with them? But that doesn't tell me anything about how diversity is really making an impact in your organization. It just tells me that you've gone out and, you would have probably had to try really hard not to hire women in those particular roles, right? So it doesn't really mean that you've had any effect on it. It just means that things went as planned. Right? So if you're going to measure this, you have to actually measure what you want to change. You can't measure the overall numbers. You have to measure numbers in places where they matter to you, right? And then you've got to set targets the same way. So none of these overall numbers. If I come back here next year and I'm like, tell me about your diversity stats. I don't want to hear your overall number of women in your org. Cool? Okay. So recapping for y'all. The things that I would love, if you wanted to make my whole life, because I know that's why you've come here, to be like, how can I impress Holly? If you wanted to make my whole life, what you could do is focus on retention, not just on the pipeline. Stop having completely the conversation about parity right now. Let's get there in 5, 10, 50 years, depending on how all these efforts go. But today we're probably not going to do it. Totally stop worrying about hiring unqualified randos and have fun playing Talent Moneyball instead. Make yourself a budget or a target, and then measure it specifically. If you guys would go and do all of those things, I think we'd be well on our way to creating some awesome outcomes. So thanks everyone for listening. Like I said earlier, I'm Holly. My contact info is here. If you want to chat with me about any of this, if you want to nerd out about graphs, if you want to dispute whether people are in fact qualified or unqualified randos, any of that, if you want to come and talk to me, please find me later. I'll be around all the next 2 days. And yeah, have fun with all the stuff I just mentioned. Thanks.